right, so we are recording here with Emma, the Turtle Dove. She writes on fashion, interiors, and personhood. Inspiration from a lot of people. I mean, I know who John Paul II is. I know Pope John Paul, and I've heard of Simone Weil, but Edith Stein and Martin Buber, I'm not familiar with. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about what do those figures represent to you? I'm assuming you might be a Catholic. So kind of tell me where you're coming from on some of those people.
Yeah, so as seems like many people are now, I am a Catholic convert as of 5, 6 years ago. So Edith Stein is a Catholic saint, but she also was a philosopher. She worked under Husserl, and she wrote a lot on women and woman, like singular, and on personhood. So she just has a lot of wonderful things to say. She ended up becoming a Carmelite nun later in her life and was killed in a concentration camp. So she is now sainted as Saint Teresa Benedict of the Cross, I believe, but she's one of those Catholics where she's really known by her real name, her given name, Edith Stein. Martin Buber I know less about. I actually learned about him in a class that I took last year, just kind of for fun. I was working towards my master's, but I have two kids under 3, and it just ended up being not the right phase of life to finish that. But he was rather a controversial figure, but he was a Jewish philosopher also around the same time. He was a militant Zionist, from what I understand, but on the other hand, he wrote this really beautiful book called I and Thou on personhood and on like relationships, and it's very similar to John Paul II's thought in that way, in his theology of the body, like how do persons interact and how should they properly interact. So when it comes to interiors and fashion, like that's really what I'm interested in, a little bit less than obviously I love to curate a wardrobe or decorate a house or get dressed, but really more like now that our culture is in a space where that has really disintegrated or been like completely scattered, how could we like envision returning to like a national dress or just ways of dressing or homemaking, like literally homemaking that actually speak to who we are and how we should be interacting with each other.
So I assume you're an American, and when you use the term national dress, what comes to mind is the idea that there is a certain way that an American should dress, and I think in the past, the 1950s or something, people did have a conception of this is how you dress if you're an auto mechanic, this is how you dress if you're a professor, this is how you dress if you're a doctor, this is how you dress if you're a businessman, this is how you dress on Sunday when you go to church. And there was a conception of that for men, and there was a conception of that for women, and there was also a conception of how children should dress as opposed to adults. We still have some of those conceptions, but as you've said, they're fragmented and they're polarized. Some people believe, it's acceptable to dye your hair. Some people believe tattoos are acceptable. Other people think piercings are acceptable, ear piercings, but then you've got nose piercings. So there's a lot of disagreement and divergence, and I think if you say the word fashion, I think what people conceive of is those who are interested in differentiating themselves as individuals from others with their fashion. That's how I think it's conceived of in the popular imagination. But you're suggesting that fashion, maybe ideally, in your opinion, should be a collective cultural standard, or a series of norms that we all aspire to, an ideal that we're all trying to converge on. Is that accurate?
Yes, I do. I do think that fashion, like properly used or approached, is supposed to. I mean, you have to walk the line between allowing for individual expression, obviously, and having certain cultural norms. Because if you don't have any norms, then the personal expression is meaningless. There's no, if there, I think it's almost like, not like rules are meant to be broken type of thing, but more like, let's see, how do I phrase it? I suppose if there's individual expression and that's all there is, but there are no fashion norms, then the norms are what allow us to have healthy functioning relationships between each other. So if all you're doing is being concerned with your individual expression via your clothes or your interior, but you have no concern for those around you and what makes them comfortable or what is appropriate for your context that you're in with these other people, then your relationships aren't functional, and ultimately your society isn't functional. So I'm not exactly sure where that line is. I don't think we should return to, everyone wearing the same thing. Not that ever really happened anywhere but very certain places and small instances, as far as I know. But I do think that there needs to be a stricter grid to work within, and that actually allows greater individual expression. Like, the best example I can think of is more related to interiors, but it's like, if you have a home and you only have a certain amount of budget, and your budget for decorating, that actually liberates you to be able to decorate, because your options are limited to the point that you're able to choose things. I do think it's easier in some senses to express yourself when you have a limit in a box in which you have to express yourself. I guess, did that answer your question?
I guess where I was going to go with that is this question of what is an American.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that if I was going to say, an American fundamentally is someone who believes in racial and gender equality. That's what defines an American. Then the type of fashion that I would create that would represent that would be very different if I said the definition of an American is someone who's, if not religiously Christian, at least culturally Christian, somebody who respects the founding fathers, the free market, and our culture of prosperity or something. That'd be a different.
Right.
There would be a different artistic representation of those ideals.
Right.
So yeah, that's the question I would put to you: is
Okay.
what is an American?
Yeah, what is an American? This is funny because my husband and I have been talking about this a lot. Actually, he sent me one of your articles, the one in which you talk about men going into politics as equal and opposite to women going into interiors, which was hilarious because that is our relationship. That's his interest, and my interests are definitely more aesthetic, but they're related in terms of they're related in that way. So we've been talking about what is an American,
All right,
whether or not
so
it's defined by some broad descriptor of looks or skin color or anything like that, or values. I don't know if I'm able to really articulate a response that I would be happy with, but I do have to say I think that the cultural Christian part is an important part of American identity, even for those who have completely abandoned it, because many of them have. I do agree with the take that they've all embraced like the alternative to that, which is basically a fragmented, progressive version of Christianity. So I do think that is part of it. Like we should dress as informed by that. Other parts are probably back to towing the line between individual expression and like a societal norm of clothing. Definitely, Americans do err, obviously, on the side of individual expression, which is why I don't think you can put like the cat back in the bag with that as far as how the fashion industry has changed in the last few decades towards individual expression. So that's a very long-winded way of saying I suppose it's both Christian and individualistic, but then I feel the proper. I feel like that's always going to be followed up by someone saying like, okay, so do we need like modesty rules? Um, which I really don't know how I feel about that necessarily. Like, I don't want to be writing a modesty blog. Um, but I do think there is something to be said about maybe defining the context that the average American always finds themselves in and deciding what, like, the Christian virtue of modesty in terms of clothing looks like in those different contexts. And it will look very different depending on the context. But yeah, I mean, I think maybe that contextual approach would work in terms of deciding like what an American is and then therefore how should he or she dress.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I've spoken with people who definitely would reject the label of being a cultural Christian, but at the same time, or Christian at all, they still would go on TikTok or something and be like, oh, I love these clothes from the 1960s, and I just think the hoop skirts are so amazing. And I was like, do you not feel at some point that that sort of fashion, which you express an admiration for and an appreciation for, how are you able to exercise the cognitive dissonance where you can dissociate the meaning of the fashion from its presentation, from its appearance? And this isn't like an isolated one-off random person, but I've seen this repeatedly where there are women who seem to actually have like a fascination with, and maybe this is for subconscious reasons, maybe this is their way of kind of expressing a sense of loss over the individualism or the factionalization of culture, or promiscuity, or gender conflict. But I've always found that fascinating that there will be women who will describe themselves as progressive and as opposed to the culture of the 1960s, but they're very interested in the fashion. I think that men also have a sense of nostalgia for the 1980s, but tend to have less cognitive dissonance about the politics of the 1980s and say like, oh yeah, it was, that was awesome. So it seems like men almost have an easier time recognizing. And one of the ways that I would phrase this is some people are symbolic thinkers and some people are institutional thinkers, and maybe that's not. It's kind of an experimental framework I'm thinking about, but I think men, for instance, will say things like, the border represents the country, and if we don't have a strong border, then we don't have a strong country. Or driving a Mustang and eating a cheeseburger and shooting a gun, that represents masculinity. So there's very symbolic syllogisms. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think oftentimes women are more focused on institutions and they're much more flexible or open-minded or adaptable when it comes to symbolism. So yeah, you can have someone who would say, I repudiate the culture of, segregation and prior to civil rights and so on, but the fashion was really good. And one of the ways I see this represented is in theater. So there's like musicals like Grease, or I honestly don't watch a lot of these musicals, so I don't know all of them, but I'll see like there's a performance with a bunch of girls in hoop skirts, but the people who are really dedicated to theatrical arts tend to be much more left-wing. So I'm like, why is it that in some senses liberals seem to have more nostalgia for the 1960s than conservatives, who generally are more focused on the 1980s? What does that reflect internally? What kind of needs are people trying to meet when they say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could dress like this again? How does that have to do with maybe on the right, the sense of being a rebel and being individualistic and adventurous, versus on the left maybe seeking kind of healing or conformity or peace, or time when America had come together, we didn't have these internal divisions. I guess in what sense is fashion complicated but aspirational rather than practical, in the sense that a lot of these women I talk to who say, like, I like this fashion, they don't just go out and buy the dresses, wear that. I don't think they're ever going to do that, but they're still going to like the picture on the Pinterest. So there's this sense in which there's a whole culture of, or even cosplay, for example, using fashion as something exceptional and apart from your daily life, and viewing it as something that is an ability for you to escape from your current context and to imagine a different context, as a form of fantasy and storytelling, rather than, this is what I wear to church every Sunday. These are my work clothes. This is what I wear in the evening. This is, my nightgown or something. So I guess, what do you think about that, that distance between fashion as an aspiration, as an exception, like you see on the runway, people wearing dresses that are totally impractical. You could never wear those, around the house or around town or something. They're just too unwieldy and fragile. So there's aspirational fashion, which is like ideal and exceptional, and then there's the kind of like the actual clothing that people wear on a regular basis. Do you feel like, that division there is significant, and what does that mean to you?
So just to clarify, do you want me to talk about why people are attracted to older fashions from eras that they say they would not want to live in, or do you want me to talk about like the difference between like high fashion and low fashion now?
I have a really bad habit of throwing out a lot of questions, and I guess choose whichever ones are more attractive to you. I guess I'm giving you options, because sometimes I feel like I ask a question, I'm like, oh, is that a good question? Is that too complicated? Is that like, are you going to say like, oh, I don't really think about that? So that's kind of why I'm giving you the option. Take it wherever you want.
I just want to make sure. I think to the second question, I actually was just thinking I'll answer that one really quickly, just with the reference to the movie The Devil Wears Prada, which every fashion girl knows, where she's like, I'm not interested in fashion. And, Meryl Streep gives this like spiel about how like all of the ridiculous things on the runway have trickled down, and that is why she's wearing like a blue sweater of a particular like shade. Even though she's not interested in fashion. So that's kind of my like glib answer to that part. I think that's a really good explanation in that movie, actually. But back to why people find fashion from eras that are quote unquote oppressive interesting to them. Well, I think especially for women, I think this has been coming up a lot lately with like all of the trad wife discourse, and which has really been beaten to death. But I did read I can't remember who it was by, but I did read a very interesting essay on that the other day, where the author was talking about how people, especially women, they can't look away from this sort of content, like the old beautiful fashion, and like women being very competent at life sustaining skills. They can't look away, even if it's like hate, hate watching or whatever, because it's everything you've been like taught and raised not to like. Like we've, as a girl, even as a toddler, most women are not putting their like little babies in like beautiful clothing. Like you're just we've been enculturated to think that beauty is like this bad, like no thing. Like trying to be beautiful in a non like pornographic way is, yeah, I guess I'm speaking of like beautiful, like capital B, like beauty, the transcendental, like aspiring to that in your everyday, and in your everyday clothes and in your home is a no. Like that's not cool. You're not supposed to do that. And so that's why people are drawn to those things, is because like we have an innate desire to have beauty around us. Since it is a transcendental, like that's beauty, goodness, and truth. That's like the desires of our human nature, and we're starved of that. And so I think people, particularly women, look back at eras when, I mean, there's never been a perfect understanding of beauty and dress, but eras when it was more apparent, like more objective, and they might not know why they like a dress from a certain era better, but I do think it has something to do with that. It's like something that we've been starved of now. I do think that's also why like women are now running around in like smocked and linen dresses, because it's like cathartic. Like you've been told you have to be looking like grungy. I mean, I went to university in Seattle, where if you were dressing as, and I'm not just saying like if you're looking tomboy or wearing masculine clothes, that can't be beautiful. I do think that putting an outfit together is more about like proportions, symmetry, balance of colors, and all of that. It can still turn out to be beautiful. It doesn't have to be like quote unquote traditionally feminine or whatever to be beautiful. But there's definitely a vein now in which it's almost an act of rebellion to dress in like an obviously feminine way. So I don't know why people who are
All right, so
are very leftist or liberal are really attracted to that, but maybe it's almost because it's like a forbidden thing to them, I suppose, is a
I
summary
am
of my
here with
answer.
bad dad.
And it also because you do yearn for beauty in your daily life, and those fashions were just objectively more beautiful than your leggings and your like yoga top sweatshirt thing that you're wearing every single day.
Yeah,
Sweating microplastics into your skin.
yeah, I see. Well, I think it's interesting because there's something you're identifying here, which is that women have an aversion to looking like they have put too much effort into their appearance, because then you're a pick-me, then you're a try-hard. And actually, I think when women do that, they're risking a lot of social aggression from other women, not so much men. If I see a woman who's clearly spent a lot of time on her makeup, she's wearing a big flowing dress, it's, maybe kind of, it's not the most practical thing if you're going to ride a horse or a motorcycle or something, but she looks like a Disney princess or something. I'm not going to look at that woman and think, she thinks she's better than me. Because as a man, I'm not competing with her for male attention. But I think for women, there is this kind of mean girls tendency to really care about what other women are doing, to gossip, to rumor monger, and to engage in forms of passive aggression. And so I think as a woman, you're always trying to ride this line between, on the one hand, there is a social pressure to dress to attract men, because men treat you differently. When you're a woman and you you don't do your makeup and you throw something together and you're wearing sweatpants and a tank top or something, men are probably not going to be as nice to you as if you put some effort into your appearance. But be careful, because if you put in too much effort, then other women are going to start to criticize you and get on your case about it and say, oh, you think you're better than me. So women are because of these two social forces, they're almost kind of pigeonholed into this weird sort of fashion that you're describing, where it's like yoga pants, athletic gear, something where it's like, oh, I'm just going to the gym, oh, I'm just casual. And I see this, like when I go to the gym, I see women who are wearing this quote unquote athletic clothing. It's not practical at all. I mean, it's like this weird sports bra with like 6 different straps, and there's like a hole in the middle, and then like their yoga pants, like the seam of the yoga pants is like very suggestive. So it's like, okay, this is clearly fashion. You are not just, oh, I'm just going to the gym and this is just what's comfortable. No. I think in our culture at this point, our sense of fashion actually is, at least for women, extremely expressive. It's more expressive than the gym than it is in many other contexts, which is kind of, again, feeds into that irony or that tension where as a woman, other women will come along and say, like, they'll basically attack you for trying to look too nice, but, at the same time, women are under this constant pressure to appeal to the male gaze or male attention. So it produces, this weird, like sorority girls or something. It's like, okay, there's this sorority girl uniform where they're all wearing yoga pants and they're all dyed-haired blonde and they're tan.
Yeah.
And, it's like there's a certain
They
look
literally
to
have to wear the same thing so that their house doesn't like explode with like, just like bitterness and resentment. I swear it's like a cope to be able to, it's like so the relationship. That's why nuns all wear the same thing, like, and monks too. But I think it's more important for women, like you're saying, like, it's very, tread carefully.
Yeah, I mean, men don't deal with that. I mean, obviously, as a man, I think if you dressed up in some kind of 1940s costume and things, like, other men might think you're weird.
Yeah, everyone knows bow tie guy or something like that.
I think with men, generally, the criticism as far as fashion and okay, so a guy like Harry Styles dresses up. He puts on a dress, and a lot of conservative men, will say, hey, this is performative. You're just doing this to get attention. Or there's almost kind of like this more incel contingent that will be like, oh, well, Harry Styles can literally wear everything. This is a flex because he's so famous. Women will be attracted to him no matter what, or he's so handsome. Whereas if I do that, or if a normal man does that, then he's going to be laughed at, or he's going to be ridiculed or something. So this is totally, it's almost like you're signaling how hot you are as a man by kind of actively sabotaging your appearance. That's sort of one theory. And that's a theory in terms of maybe cross-dressing or integrating like transgender kind of aspects. I see that on TikTok a lot, men painting their nails black or wearing a pearl necklace, and everything else will be masculine presenting, but they'll do this like one weird trick to differentiate themselves. And that clearly, the way that men interpret that is, you are just trying to appeal to a certain kind of a quirky group of women. And oftentimes, I perceive that kind of signaling as much more appealing toward young women who maybe are more attracted to the idea of novelty versus at some point in the maturity process, you start to become more interested maybe in other more classical masculine attributes. Or I think there's something, a story I guess I'll tell here is that an interaction between two people